Sì, prova, prova, sì, prova, prova.
We have to start. È possibile. Keep quiet. Quiet. Can you come in? Maurizia, can you sit down? Eduardo, please sit down. Can you close the doors? Can you please close the doors? Hans. Senta. Ah, quindi siamo tutti qui. Sì, chiuda subito e se c'è qualcuno ancora in piedi no, ci sono ancora le poste, però chiuda le porte. Senti Ruth, mi raccomando, io ho l'impressione che devi essere... Come potrei non fidarmi? Welcome. Can you... Welcome to this third plenary session. The topic is gender and the boundaries of public law. My right is Professor Ruth Rubio Marin. She's a professor here at the European University Institute. Matthias Kumm is a professor at the Humboldt Universität in Berlin. And on my left is Marta Cartabia. She's a professor of constitutional law at the University of Milan and Justice Italian Constitutional Court. Ruth, you can start. Third plenary session. The topic is gender and the boundaries of public law. My right is Professor Ruth Rubio Marin. She's a professor here at the European University Institute. Matthias Kumm is a professor at the Humboldt University.
So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great honor to be here today with you, participating in this new and exciting adventure. I would like to start my talk, if you allow me, with a confession. It has to do with two recent moments of inner celebration. The first one is portrayed in this picture. This picture was taken a few months ago in Beirut as a workshop on gender and constitutionalism was taking place. The man you see in the image is a man in his 60s, Syrian, in exile. And what you see him doing is taking the current Syrian constitution in thinking of ways about inserting gender justice for, hopefully, someday, a democratic and inclusive Syrian polity. So quite frankly, I did not think I'd live to see this day. And the second moment is actually today. I was very happy, indeed I was moved when the conveners of this event and the founding fathers of the new society asked me to speak today. And I was not just moved because they asked me, but I was particularly moved because they asked me to talk about gender and the limits of public law. So I consider this a celebration for feminist constitutionalism, which is an area that has been growing and gaining shape over just the last 10, 15 years. And I'm very glad to see many of the faces of the people who are contributing to it sitting here today. I also take it, and this is what really thrills me, as a sign of commitment of this new society that it will remain open not just to methodological pluralism, but to all kinds of critical approaches to law and governance. So when I told Joseph Weiler that I was happy and I was going to publicly congratulate the founding fathers of this new venture, he kind of got the critical tone in it, and he said, "Oh no, Ruth, you're getting it all wrong. This is not about founding fathers. This is about same-sex marriage." So then I asked Sabino, because nowadays these things have to be consensual, you know? And he seemed fine. So I take this to be a sign of encouragement so that fathers, mothers, women, men, but youth will join in this new and exciting venture. So without further ado, and I will ask the picture to be removed, please. I would like to accompany me today on a journey that describes a gradual yet unfinished project. It's the project of gender disestablishment looked at through the lenses of constitutional law. This is a play in 2 acts. Act 1 addresses the constitutional embedding of the gender order at the dawn of constitutionalism and its only partial disestablishment throughout the 20th century. And Act 2 brings us to present-day constitutional struggles that I think show how the gender disestablishment process is an ongoing one, and I will approach it by describing 3 domains of constitutional struggle. First, gender quotas. Second, same-sex marriage. And third, care. Yes, care and constitutionalism. Act 1. 19th century constitutionalism and that of the first half of the 20th century were built on the assumption of women's relegation to and subordination within the private sphere. Sex inequality was central to both the liberal and the republican traditions of citizenship that constitutionalism simply inherited. Within modernity, women's place in society and in the polity came to be crafted around the separate spheres tradition articulated along a double axis. One axis of subordination, inherited from pre-modernity, and an axis of separation or differentiation, which was more typically modern. It is this gender order, in this gender order, marital and family law were key instruments, for they shaped the contours of what we now identify as the traditional family, dictating women's distinctive citizenship. Now, interestingly, in spite of its central importance, the first constitutions, if we think of the US Constitution, but also of the early French post-revolution constitutions, are for the most part silent about the family. Now, if you think about it, this is really not that surprising, given the revolutionaries' period emphasis on foregrounding the individual and breaking away from the ancien regime's privileging of intermediate bodies and status. Yet in spite of this constitutional silence, the direct link between the construction of the family order, relegating women to the private, and the exclusion from women can be easily confirmed through the many gender subtexts present in many of the court's decisions of the time. Consider, for instance, Justice Bradley's 1873 concurrent opinion in U.S. Supreme Court decision Bradwell versus State, denying women the right to practice law, focusing specifically on the petitioner's status as a married woman. And now Justice Bradley will have to excuse me, but in my mind, this reads with a male voice. The Constitution of the Family Organization, which is founded in the divine ordinance, as well as in the nature of things, indicates the domestic sphere as that which properly belongs to the domain and functions of womanhood. The harmony, not to say identity of interests and views which belong or should belong to the family institution is repugnant to the idea of a woman adopting distinct and independent career from that of her husband. The paramount destiny and mission of women are to fulfill the noble and benign offices of wife and mother. This is the law of the Creator, and the rules of civil society must be adapted to the general constitution of things and cannot be based upon exceptional cases. Now, in European constitutionalism, with the gradual development of the welfare state from approximately the 1880s onto the onset of World War I, this silence around the family was in fact overcome. Indeed, if you take a look at interwar period constitutions, for instance, the Weimar Constitution, if you look at Article 119 in that constitution, you will find references to the family and as a repository of the social function of care and references to motherhood as a supposedly vulnerable condition. Now, it was precisely during the 19th century that most Europeans and North Americans came to accept a new view of husbands as providers and as wives as nurturing homebodies. But this ideal could not only be achieved by a majority of families until the mid-20th century, as it implied the possibility of surviving on one single wage, the family wage, the breadwinner's wage. Now, if you notice, what this means is that there is a significant overlap in time between the heyday of the breadwinner family model, precisely in the 50s and 60s, coinciding with the strong post-war pronatalist movement and the early post-World War II wave of European constitutionalism. Because of this is what I claim, such constitutionalism represents a mix between continuity and progressive change rather than full rupture with the underlying gendered political and economic order established since modernity. Now let me explain. It is true, of course, that post-war constitutionalism, as well as the broader European and human rights revolutions that were taking place at the same time, are characterized, among other things, by the explicit articulation of the principle of equality between the sexes. Though, to be quite honest, if you go to interwar constitutions, you will find that reference to sex equality as well. And had the ERI in the United States passed, you would find that reference dating as back as 1923. It is also true that where it did not already exist, this constitutionalism brought about women's suffrage, the fruits of first wave feminism finally being ready to be universally harvested. Yet at the same time, some sex-based distinctions, very explicit ones, remained and remain still today, such as, for instance, in the military domain. If you look at Article 12A in the German Constitution today, or Article 13 in the Swedish Constitution, you will find references to these military distinctions. But also, not just the military, but if you look at my own constitution, my own country in Spain, you will find discriminatory rules on the succession of the crown. But more importantly, sex equality understandings remained centrally limited by the predominant family ideology, of which one finds abundant explicit traces. So if you take a look at Italy's 1947 current constitution or the Grundgesetz in 1949, you will find that both indeed contain references to sex equality, but you will also find, for instance, if you look at the German constitution, a reference to the need to protect the family, to protect specifically motherhood. The Italian text being even more explicit in this regard, as this refers to the family wage as a concept and to women's essential family duties, which the Italian text says must be respected through adequate working conditions. So 1873, Justice Bradley, 1947, the Italian Constitution, not all that much had changed. Now, this family ideology was also reinforced in the early case law of the constitutional courts at the time. In Italy, you will find jurisprudence dating from the early 60s, where the Constitutional Court clearly affirmed husband's marital authority as well as his obligation to provide for his wife. In Germany, the German Federal Constitutional Court also was a little bit more nuanced because it clearly rejected from the start the idea of subordination. But it did not reject the separate but equal. It did not reject the idea of differentiation, and in fact, it developed an entire doctrine based on the idea that objective biological or functional differences could be justified under the sex equality doctrine. So this is crucial. Namely, in terms of gender disestablishment, the first true breakthrough moment must be located around the 1970s and is directly related to second wave feminism's challenge to women's relegation to the private sphere. It is then that courts started to read out of their constitutions the need to overcome this women's distinct marital status, basically, and expand women beyond the role of the family, focusing more and more on market equality. Yet, constitutionally, this was articulated in two different ways on each side of the Atlantic. And I will try to show that this has been relevant for later developments. And I will now ask you to accompany me to these two sides of the Atlantic. So in the US, in the United States, it was women's rights advocates that starting in the 1970s persuaded the court to read guarantees of sex equality into the Equal Protection Clause. In Frontiero versus Richardson, 1973, the court articulated the now orthodox view that laws based on sex stereotypes are constitutionally impermissible. Formal equality was affirmed, and strict gender neutrality became the ultimate goal that the legal order aspired to. Now, not surprisingly, the effects were soon to be seen in the realm of family law, which is where these distinctions had really remained most pervasive, with men often taking the lead in coming forward as plaintiffs and challenging all kinds of formal inequalities. From then on, whatever the statistical evidence would say about enduring functional as opposed to strictly biological differences, i.e. women change more diapers than men, any law that generalized on the basis of such evidence would be interpreted as entrenching different sex roles and hence as discriminatory. This framing of the constitutional sex equality principle limited the possibilities of protecting pregnant women and working mothers, for fear that these protective measures would be nothing else than measures that confined women to the traditional subordinate status. So as a result, what we see in the US is a form of assimilationist, workerist equality, which has prevailed even to this day. Under this model, protections of motherhood have always been minimal. They have been legislative, not of a constitutional nature, especially since 1974, when the US Supreme Court rejected the idea that pregnancy-based discrimination amounted, constitutionally speaking, to sex discrimination on the obvious argument that not all women are pregnant, right? So these measures, to the extent that there have been protective measures, they have been crafted in gender-neutral ways, mostly through assimilation of pregnancy and motherhood to generic sickness, or family care-related needs. And this, I claim, among others, has contributed to rendering the social value of human reproduction invisible, yet leaving gendered patterns shaped around it untackled. Now, if we return to Europe, what we see is a different landscape. The European account has it so that constitutional sex discrimination doctrine has not privatized or silenced pregnancy and motherhood, but rather sought the adoption of at least some measures, including of mandatory nature. Think of mandatory maternity leaves, which in the US are mind-blowing, mandatory, to facilitate the combination of paid employment and unpaid care labor for women, thereby accommodating rather than ignoring or subverting women's unique role in reproduction and family sustenance. So it is true that around the 1970s, there is a strong moment of constitutional convergence, I would say. The emphasis is placed on formal equality, gender neutrality, and you see the Italian and the German constitutional courts backtracking and not accepting or being less deferential to sex-based distinction. But as early as the 1980s, what you see in Europe is this new doctrine that places an emphasis not on anti-stereotyping, but on overcoming disadvantage and ensuring women's equal opportunities. Europe's unique constitutional synthesis, which combines elements of the welfare and the state traditions, has indeed shaped the features of this constitutional sex discrimination model, which is committed to substantive equality notions and remains loyal, as I claim, to the needs to protect the family and motherhood as a matter of constitutional law. Moreover, the rejection of intent requirements in the sex constitutional doctrine and the acceptance of indirect discrimination has allowed European constitutional courts to check for the impact on formally neutral norms on women, taking into account women's specific forms of inhabiting the labor market, for instance, by taking on more of the part-time employment, right? So in other words, it's attending to gendered realities that has been the preferred track. The fact that doing so could mean entrenching such gender inequalities has been deemed of secondary importance. Now, this said, until very recently, the scope of application of substantive equality also in Europe has remained limited to the employment domain. It has not reached the domain of politics, where gender differentials in terms of representation remained and remain unabashed, or corporate governance, which it remains almost exclusively male. It has not reached the division of tasks inside of the family either. Respect to the internal organization of the family and neutrality of the state have been the predominant doctrine to this regard. Yet, as I will claim, such neutrality was much easier to promise than to actually deliver. So to summarize Act 1, what we see is that in the 20th century constitutionalism, especially since the 1970s, this constitutionalism has allowed sex equality, understood as formal equality and gender neutrality, to challenge the most clear expressions of the separate spheres tradition, basically denying the possibility of according men and women a different legal status of rights and duties. There are a few exceptions, mostly in Europe, with regards to pregnancy and motherhood employment-related accommodations, as well as some exceptions, as I mentioned, regarding the domain of citizenship duties, such as the military, in the military context. However, the constitutional sex equality doctrine has been a limited tool to subvert the separate spheres ideology in the 20th century. We can see this most clearly in the US, where a relentless emphasis on formal equality and gender neutrality has translated into anti-stereotyping conceptions of gender equality, which in theory promise to free women from gender stereotypes, but in reality limits the possibility to cater to gender-specific needs of working women and ends up relegating motherhood and care entirely to the private domain. European constitutionalism, in contrast, has allowed and even compelled that there be specific measures enabling women to combine work outside and inside of the house. And in many ways, it has indeed fared better. Women have fared better under this model. Yet, as developed throughout the last century, the European model risks entrenching rather than subverting gender roles when it implicitly underscores motherhood and the special relationship between a woman and her child, providing protection measures which can backfire against market forces, and implicitly endorsing a limited understanding of the importance and nature of fatherhood. Moreover, both constitutional traditions have so far failed to do one thing, that is, moving past formal equality and gender neutrality beyond the market domain. Constitutionally entrenched notions of family privacy have justified courts' resistance to interfere with internal family arrangements, and procedural representation accounts of democracy living up to formal equality have left women's systematic underrepresentation in the political sphere unchallenged. This, ladies and gentlemen, has allowed for de facto gender inequalities to continue unabashed in some domains, precisely those domains which since modernity have grounded women's distinctive citizenship. End of Act 1. Act 2. So in contemporary democracies, the gaze is expanding and attention is no longer singularly placed on women's market equality. Rather, new approaches are being proposed that go not only beyond gender neutrality and formal equality, but also beyond rights, seeking to examine institutions with a focus on role differentiation in every possible form of manifestation. Also, new narratives and framings that go beyond a focus on women are articulated, including those of gender balance representation, parity in decision-making, balance of family work for everyone, equal partnership in the domain of domestic responsibility. Several legislative and policy agendas seeking the active disestablishment of gender roles in both the public and private spheres of participation are indeed proliferating. And what is interesting is that to some extent, constitutionalism is facilitating this transformative agenda, yet in many settings, constitutionalism is also a reactionary force, as I will show. Interestingly, it is new constitutionalism in other parts of the world. Here we're traveling wider, such as, for instance, Latin America, that seems to be providing the best platform for the project of gender disestablishment, at least from an expressivist perspective. The gap between the law and the practice, including constitutional law, is always a big one, and in some parts of the world, it's even bigger. So in the remaining time, I will illustrate this shift by focusing briefly on three contemporary domains of constitutional struggle, the ones I announced: gender quotas, same-sex marriage or unions, and care. Starting from the 1990s, Latin America became the world region pioneering the adoption of legislative quotas to empower women. This process proceeded without much constitutional resistance, and in fact, it is in this region of the world that we see the first constitutional reforms so as to include provisions that allow for specific measures to enhance women's participation in the political process. Let me just mention Colombia, Paraguay, and Argentina as texts, constitutional texts where you will find this. In Europe, the agenda of balanced participation of women and men in decision-making has been very actively promoted, both by the Council of Europe and the European Union. More and more, what you can see is that member states in the European Union are indeed passing legislation making gender parity or not too big a disparity mandatory, and that this process is having spillover effects on the domain of corporate governance with the spread of legislative measures also to ensure women's seats in company boards, including a proposed European Commission directive on this subject matter, which is pending approval. In Europe, however, constitutionalism has been much more of a force of resistance against changing understanding of gender equality. And more importantly, not just gender equality, democracy and representation, right? So there have been fierce constitutional struggles, starting with the Conseil Constitutionnel, when in 1982 it struck down legislation making a minimum of 25% of candidates in local elections, imposing male and female minimum thresholds of 25%, but also the Italian Constitutional Court in 1995, the Swiss Constitutional Court twice, 1997 and 98. In these decisions, it was clear that the courts felt uncomfortable with just framing the debate in terms of formal substantive equality. It was the democracy understanding that was at stake. Thus, it is not surprising that the spread of legislative quotas has been indeed in Europe accompanied by a wave of constitutional amendments, making this process feasible, right? Portugal, Slovenia, Italy, and France have amended their constitutions in this regard. Yet interestingly, the idea of parity or gender-balanced democracy seems to be gaining foothold and expanding in contemporary constitution making. Morocco's 2011 constitution has explicitly incorporated the notion of gender parity as framing its entire sex equality conception. Bolivia's 2009 constitution, when defining the country as a form of democracy, explicitly includes reference to men and women's equality. And also, interestingly, in Ecuador and Mexico, you see the gender parity in agenda being expanded to other domains of decision-making, including the judiciary and the executive, but also indigenous jurisdiction. This agenda, however, is not universal, and some constitutional traditions seem particularly unpromising. This is the case of the US, where the prevalent formal equality interpretation of the Equal Protection Clause that I was referring to would probably doom gender quotas just as it has doomed racial quotas. Most decisive, I think, in the US would be the claim that quotas, like any other sex-specific protective measures, stigmatize and essentialize their intended beneficiaries, women. Fears that I think would also be shared by egalitarian feminists, making this agenda a very, very, very difficult one to develop. Now, going on to the second theme, parallel to this agenda to disestablish gender roles in the public sphere, we see the development of an agenda since the late 1990s, and more importantly, since the beginning of this millennium, this agenda developing to disestablish gender in the private sphere. I'm referring to the disestablishment of family and marital heteronormativity through the legal recognition of same-sex partnership first, and now same-sex marriage, including in 11 countries on 4 continents, with Europe being the regional leader. Now, although many are understandably celebrating the inroads of this expansion of marital forms in guaranteeing gay and lesbian persons equality and liberty to develop fully and non-stigmatized emotional, sexual, reproductive, and family lives, it is clear that the disestablishment of marital heteronormativity also strikes at the core of the gendered order of society. And this time, the institution tackled is not democracy, parliaments, company boards, but marriage. The institution which has traditionally defined men normatively as husbands and women normatively as wives. In this battlefield, once again, constitutions around the world have been seized upon both by reactionary and transformative forces. The positions of supreme and constitutional courts around the world have varied. With some exceptions, I'm citing South Africa here, the recognition of same-sex marriage has not been deemed as constitutionally required. More frequent has been the thesis that if not marriage, at least a more or less equivalent legally recognized status was required for same-sex couples. I read Brazil, Colombia, Hungary, Germany, and Slovenia's decisions along these lines. Several courts have simply affirmed legislative discretion in this domain, either because legislation had been passed and they did not want to interfere against it, Spain, Mexico, France, Belgium, or because legislation had not been passed and the courts understood that it was not the role of the courts to advance such change and I'm thinking of Italy here. And now, as you know, in this domain, progression has not been linear. And in fact, there's been backlash too, and some constitutions have been reformed to make clearly and explicit that it is heterosexual marriage that is constitutionally protected. Now, what is interesting for my purpose here today is that in spite of this clear link between the heterosexual traditional marriage and patriarchy, with very few exceptions, almost none of the cases decided so far on this subject matter have attached significance to the constitutional commitment to gender equality. They have not seen gender equality as being centrally relevant in deciding these cases. Yet the implications, I think, are clear, right? And in fact, if you look at all these constitutional court decisions, what you will find is that leaving aside the understanding of the courts about their institutional roles and whether it pertained to them or the legislator to push this agenda, leaving aside that, which has been one main theme and recurrent theme, the court's positions on this topic has hinged primarily on two things. First, they have underscored those who have been most liberal and progressive in this domain have underscored the new essence of marriage. Yes, finally courts are talking love. And they have referred to commitment, support, love, affection, trust, respect, and mutual responsibility as being the essence of marriage. Second, they have underlined the departure from an exclusively reproduction-focused marriage. This is the case very clearly in the Mexican court's decision, as well as the ability to properly raise children as something that did not depend or hinge on the sexual orientation of the person. So ultimately, I think what is at stake is the expression of the victory of the love commitment-based marriage to the detriment of the more traditional marriage, that is the procreation-oriented, complementarity-based, gender-defining marriage. Sex equality as a constitutional value, I think, requires both the opening of the marital institution to same-sex couples, as well as the recognition of alternative, non-marital forms of cohabitation. The separate but equal track, here again, does not work. It does not work for gays and lesbians who are, who may be told in this way that their unions are of a second order. And it does not work for heterosexual women either. And here I want to cite Marianne Case, a scholar in the US, saying, restricting marriage to male-female couples and male-female couples to marriage means that those who wish to legally unite themselves to men must do so in an institution whose all too recent legal history is one of subordinating wives both practically and symbolically. An institution reserved for them alone because of, and not in spite of, its traditional, that is to say, patriarchal significance. Finally, care and constitutionalism. With European countries in the lead, and once again, with the involvement of great narrative on the side of European institutions, there is an ongoing agenda to change the terms in which human reproduction and care are conceptualized and accommodated. This move represents an attempt to go beyond the traditional accommodationist European model and aims at ensuring work-family balance for all, as well as the sharing of caring responsibilities between men and women as a further step to disestablish gender roles and ensure women's equal opportunities. In policy terms, this move is most clearly articulated around the promotion of paternity leaves, longer gender-neutral parental leaves, as well as specific measures to encourage men to take such leaves, including by making parental leaves or portions thereof non-transferable. Constitutionally speaking, this movement, I claim, relies on a reassessment on the figure and the understanding of fatherhood, as well as on piercing the veil of family privacy and state neutrality vis-à-vis the organization of care inside of the family. Under scrutiny have come not only those norms that still single out motherhood as opposed to fatherhood, but also the gender bias which have remained deeply embedded in gender-neutral norms in many areas of the law. That this agenda is gradually making inroads in Europe, I think, shows that Europe's traditional recognition of the centrality of motherhood has the potential to give care its proper recognition if and only if duly supplemented by further gender disestablishment. However, even in Europe, apart from programmatic language and modest legal adaptations, progress has been slow. After all, we know that in Europe, maternity leaves continue to be mandatory, whereas paternity leaves don't. Actually, Italy, I think, has 1 mandatory day of paternity leave. And for the most part, they continue paternity leaves to be optional and much shorter. So the idea that man's role in care and parenting, while increasingly important, the idea is that it is still subsidiary, right? And this is an idea that is sometimes validated by the courts. So Italy's constitutionalism provides a very interesting example, and there's a whole series of Italian constitutional court decisions that say, yes, it is true that, we have motherhood and not fatherhood protected in the Constitution, yet in every single occasion when a male plaintiff came forward asking to be extended one of these leaves, he won the case. But unfortunately, in every single case, the case was won when the plaintiff, the leave that was being claimed by the plaintiff was a leave that the mother had renounced to or been unable to enjoy, right? And the court was, as late as 1994, still willing to justify this on the basis of the more important character of the mother's presence during the first year of the child, the nature of the call of nature, says the court explicitly. Per la madre tale diritto può in certa misura qualificarsi proprio o primario. Per il padre esso ha invece carattere derivato o sussidiario, e ciò sia per la maggiore importanza della presenza della madre nel primo anno di vita del bambino, natura clamat, sia per i diversi riconoscimenti normativi. 1994. But because progress in this direction requires not only, and this is crucial, the contestation of gender roles, but a greater acceptance of the social contribution and hence responsibility towards reproduction and care, the current economic crisis provides a challenging background for this agenda to flourish. And indeed, what we find is that modest signs of progress in terms of gender disestablishment of care, such as the need that the parental leave be gender neutral, that was recently supported by the European Court of Human Rights, or the idea of non-transferability of parts of the leaves, right? What we find on this agenda is mostly signs of stagnation. And so, for instance, the EU parental leave framework from 1996 that provided a minimum of 3 months leave was amended in 2010 to extend the leave to 4 months, making explicit that one of those months was non-transferable, but proposals to further extend maternity leave from 14 to 18 or 20 weeks have not succeeded, and attempts and proposals to introduce paternity leaves have also not counted on member states' favor. But even if full gender neutrality was achieved, I claimed that would not be sufficient. No subversion of gender roles will be completed unless one is willing to go beyond formal neutrality, also in the so-called private sphere. And this requires abandoning once and for all the myth of state neutrality and piercing the veil of family privacy. Now, in constitutional law, we find some courts advancing precisely in this direction, and doing so, departing from prior precedent. This is the case of the Bundesverfassungsgericht. As we saw since the beginning, the German Constitutional Court had systematically defended the need for state neutrality in family affairs. Now, to tell you the truth, this theory of non-interference and state neutrality had in fact translated into a doctrine whereby, those willing to wish to the breadwinner family model could still do so. So basically, separate but equal. For example, as an example of how this used to be, has played out, if you look at taxation law, what you find is that Germany, after the war, had inherited a cumulative taxing system for married couples, bringing the income of both spouses together for taxation purposes. Now, given Germany's progressive taxation system, in the end, this disadvantaged married couples and two-income earners' families. Because of this, the court struck down the system, which was then replaced by a splitting system, allowing the total earnings of the couple to be divided into two, in calculating the tax by doubling the amount of tax due on half their joint income. Yet this system makes it unprofitable for both spouses to keep working unless they have similarly high incomes. So its neutrality is really an illusion, for it does not encourage women's presence on the labor market. So the court in Germany has never really abandoned rhetorically this idea of the state neutrality, yet in its jurisprudence of the new millennium, there is clearly a greater awareness expressed about really the impossibility of strict neutrality, and a greater willingness to foreground the constitutional mandate of gender equality when deciding on these issues. What is really fascinating is that much of the constitutional contestation is coming now as an expression of persons who want to stick to the breadwinner family model, which the court had traditionally protected, and are now protesting against legislation that is being passed with the explicit purpose of subverting these traditional gender roles. Let me just mention there are many fascinating examples, for instance, in the spousal support after divorce, very interesting examples on this domain, but I will maybe talk about one specific line of cases which deals with parental allowances and leaves in a legislation that was passed in 2006. One of the questions at stake was how to calculate the amount of these parental allowances. So the old system was one where basically what you would get is 300 euros per month per child, right? Depending on the annual net family income, and reduced on a sliding scale basis so that families with lower income would receive a higher benefit. This policy was replaced in 2006 with a policy that explicitly stated these purposes: 1, facilitating work-family balance; 2, increasing the fertility rate, including of young professionals; and 3, subverting gender roles, right? So according to the new system, the allowance is to be calculated in the following way, right? You take the salary that was earned by the person who's going to take the parental leave, and you apply, I think it's a 63% of that. And you top it with an 1,800 euros maximum, right? So the idea here is to increase the share of fathers taking parental leave, right? There being an incentive that the person with a higher income is the one who takes the leave, but most centrally, reducing the long employment interruptions of German mothers, right? So this legislation has been challenged by several women, including the case of one woman who had had 4 children, and her claim when it came to the 3rd child was that this new system whereby she would only be given the 300 euros because she had taken the leave the year before to take care of the 2nd child was in fact discriminatory. And she alleged the equality principle, the gender equality principle, and centrally she alleged, this was the winning card, state neutrality, right, and family privacy, exactly the doctrine that the court had been, foregrounding so far. Now, what is exciting is that you see exactly the same arguments being turned around by the court in rejecting these women's claim. The court says, no, it is in fact contrary to the spirit of gender equality that is enshrined in Article 3.2 of the German Constitution, because what you're saying, dear plaintiff, will encourage one and the same parent to leave the employment for long term. And this is what we want to avoid. So for the German-speaking audience, I was just so moved by the specific passage that you will allow me. Der Verfassungsauftrag, this is referred to 3.2, will nicht nur Rechtsnormen beseitigen, die Vor- oder Nachteile an Geschlechtsmerkmale anknüpfen, sondern für die Zukunft die Gleichberechtigung der Geschlechter durchsetzen. Dies verpflichtet den Gesetzgeber auch dazu, eine Verfestigung überkommener Rollenverteilung zwischen Mutter und Vater in der Familie zu begegnen, nach der das Kind einseitig und dauerhaft dem Zuständigkeitsbereich der Mutter zugeordnet würde. So whether one agrees or not, no illusion of neutrality. And although, all democracies are advancing and are making these small inroads, if you want to see creative and fascinating constitutional engineering, it is once again to other regions of the world that you have to look at. Now, look at this, for instance. I'm concluding in 3 minutes. Bolivia refers to equal opportunities, and thus to the idea of substantive equality within the family, right? Increasingly, we find references to fatherhood and not just motherhood, and explicit constitutional provisions that make it a state purpose to subvert these gender roles. But most mind-blowing is maybe the Constitution of Ecuador, which refers to the need to reconceptualize care as productive work, thus overcoming the dichotomy between productive and reproductive work, in care as citizenship duties. Yes, so you find the list: military service, abiding by the law, care is one of the citizenship duties. Now this is pretty revolutionary. End of Act 2. So to conclude, ladies and gentlemen, the new millennium is witnessing progress in the disestablishment of gender roles. Measures are proactively being taken to ensure that women, and not only men, inhabit the world of public and private governance, to ensure that the new forms of interpersonal support and solidarity grounded on love and commitment can compete with heterosexual marriage in ways that are more inclusive for all women as well as for gay men, and to ensure finally that fathers and not only mothers share in the joys and responsibilities of care. But progress so far has been limited. Resistance and counter-mobilization agendas have developed to contain the dissolution of the hegemony of the heterosexual marriage. Corporate boards, parliaments, and more generally public authorities are still predominantly male, and predominant is also the expectation and indeed the reality of women's greater involvement in care and parenting. Moreover, in the midst of a globalized economy with rising levels of inequality and threatened welfare states, it is unlikely that we will see that families, parents, and women will be significantly relieved from their overwhelming care work by the state and the community. The Homo economicus, now increasingly accompanied by the woman economica, remain the central figures in the public imaginary, reproduction and care still mostly being silenced as private, optional, personal, residual. A culture of life, unapologetic and non-gender normative, is missing, including one that encourages all people, men and women, to live out to their fullest potential, each and every one of his or her capabilities as a possible form of good life. Constitutional traditions that have simultaneously recognized substantive equality and the centrality of family and motherhood have the potential to allow that centrality to be retained, but also, crucially, expanded in ways that give due visibility to the equal centrality of fatherhood and care, and parenting as shared responsibility. Constitutionally speaking, such recognition should lead to the acknowledgement that a gender-neutral system is not sufficient to overcome embedded gender roles, and that state neutrality, grounded on protected spheres of privacy and non-interference to the benefits of entities such as political parties, families, and corporations, is often a fiction, giving coverage to such role and perpetuating the status quo. If gender is to be fully disestablished and sex consequently liberated, constitutional sex equality cannot be contained in terms of domains and should instead inspire a transformative agenda that addresses all those structures and institutions on which the separate spheres ideology was established. So I conclude, once the illusion of neutrality is overcome, the greatest challenge will be to protect us all from the economicist logic of profit-oriented markets, which see persons primarily as producers and consumers, relegating human reproduction and care, and thereby nothing less than human life to the category of private interests. In this regard, new constitutions which refer to care as part of citizenship and challenge the old distinctions between productive and reproductive work point to a promising cultural paradigm shift. Without adequate policies and mentalities, I'm afraid, though, that this shift will not take place and constitutions will remain dead letter. Thank you very much indeed for your patience.
Grazie Ruth. Scusami, ma hai parlato 56 minuti. Matthias Kuhm. Matthias.
So, a hard act to follow. Ruth tells a rich and engaging story, which she says has two acts. But I think conceptually speaking, one might say that it has three parts. So she tells a story about how first, at the dawn of constitutionalism, the way that gender comes up is as a story of inscribing a status, of establishing a constitutional status of free and equal. So separate and equal. So women are equal, but they are separately so and have the distinct function and role to play, etc. So that's the first part of the story. The second part of the story, which then begins in the 1960s and 70s, is a story of partial but incomplete emancipation from that particular paradigm towards what you might call a paradigm of non-discrimination. And thirdly, she tells the story, and this is the contemporary challenge and the new wave, if you like, since the 1990s, and that's a story of focusing no longer on discrimination, even though, of course, through the reinterpretation of discrimination you might get quite far, but the focus is on parity in public and private life. So we have from separate but equal, to non-discrimination, to parity in private and public life. That's the story that she tells, and that I find largely convincing, and I learned a lot reading the paper. Now, all I want to do is to add a little wrinkle as far as periodization is concerned, end with a critical caveat. But at the core of my short comment, I will briefly introduce, simply as complementary, a perspective which couldn't plausibly be expected to have been present in an overview paper as rich as it was here. But it contains an interesting thesis. And the thesis is, and the perspective I want to introduce is, that much of the development with regard to the status of women cannot be simply reduced to and explained, but should be reflected upon in the context of shifts in the understanding of citizenship connected to how we think of the connection of war, violence, citizenship, and the status of women. So I think one of the core variables, only one of the variables, but an important variable, if we want to try to explain the evolution, and if we want to understand why women struggling for equal rights had to overcome different obstacles at different times, and the voices were more likely to be heard in some contexts than in others. If we want to understand that, I think this part of the story will have to play a central role. So let me begin with my periodization issue. Now, Ruth rightly pointed out that constitutions in the 18th century, and for that matter throughout basically the whole of the 19th century, now I don't want to make a totalizing claim, I haven't read all the constitutions, not even all the Western or European constitutions written during that time, but the ones that I have looked at when I read this paper, I'm no expert in the particular area here, none of them even mention women specifically or mention family and gender issues in any way whatsoever. They explicitly don't address it in any way whatsoever. That only changed in the interwar period, so after the First World War. And if we try to understand what might also be a variable to account for that change, is that, well, to begin with, we're not surprised that there is no matter of gender in constitutions, because, as you rightly pointed out, the focus is on fighting intermediary institutions and privileges connected to the aristocracy, etc. So that was just not the core theme of what constitutional reforms were thought to be about. But towards the end of the 19th century, I think there's a different story to tell that explains the absence of references to women in constitutional documents. And it's the emergence of a nationalist understanding of citizenship, which establishes a close link between the idea of sacrifice and being part of a genuine part and a full member of the national political community. In other words, with the rise of conscription and the possibility of war, the idea that men were the ones that could be drafted into service and would, if pushed, have to sacrifice themselves for their country, that was something that justified their privileged status as full citizens towards the second half of the 19th century, with the emergence of a more aggressive kind of nationalism. Now, what changed after the First World War? Because this was, after the First World War, there was the begin of a process which ended for the most part, even though there were some laggards, Portugal and Switzerland and a number of others, but this was the time between the end of the First World War and the end of the Second World War, was the time that the recognition of women as full citizens, as people who had a right to vote, who had equal, as it said in the German Weimar Constitution, equal staatsbürgerliche Rechte and Pflichten. So as public citizens, they had the same rights, not in the economic sphere and with regard to private life, but as citizens they had an equal right to vote. Now, and it's those constitutions, the modern, the 20th century constitutions, not the 19th century constitutions, that established a nexus between equal political rights, at least with regard to an equal right to vote, and at the same time functional differentiation. So the idea that women had a very particular role to play as equals, who had an equal right to vote, and their role was primarily that as a mother and husband to generate the next generation of children, the next members of the national community, which included the sons which would have to sacrifice themselves if called upon in the next war. Now, what accounts for this change between the late 19th and after the First World War? Well, the First World War was the first major conflict in which the majority of soldiers that were killed, and there were approximately 10 million, were conscripts. So this was a situation where, in some sense, the old nationalist ideology of sacrifice became very real. It actually happened. It wasn't just an idea that peripherally was instantiated by some battles fought here and there by a minority of people. It was actually a cultural phenomenon. It was widespread. And in that context, what became very clear was not only that women in that type of context had to stand in for men and join the labor force, so they were all of a sudden part of economic life in the way that they weren't before. But secondly, also, that they suffered and sacrificed by losing their husbands and sons. So this is a weird way, it fits perfectly with that kind of conceptualization of the woman, that the sacrifice of the woman in this type of imagination of citizenship lies in the fact that she sacrifices her husband and her sons, and that can be thought of as an equal participation in the sacrifice that is the sacrificial community, her contribution to the sacrificial community that is the national community. So that's that experience. And think of, for example, the commemoration in the Neue Wache unter den Linden in Berlin. There is a Käthe Kollwitz Pieta, which is supposed to be a monument. It's a very strange thing. It's a monument, supposed to be a monument memorializing war and despotism in Europe. And it's the picture of, it's a sculpture of a mother and her dead child and a dead son. So it's this imagination, I think, that is characteristic for the separate but equal stage of the development. So in the early 20th century, women are accepted as equal, and equal means that they have full rights as citizens. They participate in the political process, at least they have a right to vote. But they are functionally differentiated and have their very specific role to play as part of the national community. So that's, I think, the story of the interwar years up until the end of the Second World War. Now, what changes in the 1960s and 70s? What changes in the 1960s and 70s from the perspective that I am focusing on here is a new peace movement and a discrediting of forced violence. Think about the last war that was fought with conscripts by a liberal democracy. And the one exception is Israel here for very specific reasons. But the last war fought with conscripts by a liberal democracy was Vietnam. And Vietnam War ended when it was clear that that those who could defer by going to college under US law, that time had run out and they would actually have to serve. That was the moment where the United States had to stop fighting the war because political resistance was too strong. It was the same time where in Europe, all of a sudden, the new generation challenged their fathers and grandfathers and asked, what were you doing in the 1930s and 1940s? And with it came a deep discrediting of the idea that you were just serving your country by being drafted into military service and fighting a war. So it's the discrediting of the sacrificial link between war, conscription, and citizenship that played a significant role, I think, at least as one variable to explain why non-discrimination arguments all of a sudden had a greater appeal, also with regard to women from the 60s and 70s onwards. And of course, if we then focus to the 90s and the present, the characteristic fact is that at least in the world that was the focus of the paper, which wasn't just the transatlantic world, it also included South America, but it's a world in which the idea of nations facing each other in the pose of gladiators with national citizens having to sacrifice themselves, fight wars in the name of the community, is in some sense deeply discredited. It's connected to a nationalist idea that is deeply discredited, and with it came the abolishment in most states of conscription. So it still continued to exist in the 60s and 70s. It was just not used to actually fight wars. But since the 1990s, there has been a tendency to abolish conscription altogether, to abolish military service. And so today, 24 out of 28 NATO countries no longer have conscription. And so one might say the story or the additional element I'm trying to introduce here is to suggest that genuine gender equality is only possible and was historically only developed only in the context of the discrediting of an ideal of nationality and citizenship that connected that idea to ideas of military sacrifice of conscripted citizens. So that's just an additional complementary idea, set of ideas. It's not meant to be as the story that explains the evolution of women's rights, but it's supposed to be an additional factor to consider in the overall historical account. Now, one last point, and this is now the critical caveat. With the death of a conception of nationalism, citizenship, of the kind that I described, we have, as at least a subcurrent, some would claim as a dominant hegemonic issue, an ideology which in the United States would benignly be called democratic capitalism, and in Europe is more likely to be called neoliberalism and looked at very critically. And the story there, and the story from then onwards, from the 60s, 70s, so just as one paradigm is on the wane and something else replaces it, this something else is not genuinely equal citizenship or free and equals. It's not a liberal ideal in some ways. It's more a story about how commodification, the commodification of citizenship, the devaluation of citizenship, which was a theme of one of the panels on our previous days, in which Rainer Bauberg gave an interesting talk. So the devaluation of citizenship, the commodification of citizenship, Achelat Shachar spoke about that, substitutes that. And when we ask women being, when in the end you argue for an end of the division between production and reproduction, and to recognize the productive nature and the value of care, then of course that is right when it comes to acknowledging it as valuable. But we must see that the tendencies that favor parity between genders at this point in time are also the same. So gender parity is, in this area at least, seems to be to a large extent aligned with commodification. So if we recognize care as work, for example, then one way to deal with it is to commodify it, have both parties, both parents work in the labor force, and then buy the services of someone who then provides care. So what will matter, I think, is to achieve parity and think about what this means doctrinally and with regard to policy proposals to ensure that parity doesn't simply become another vehicle through which commodification and neoliberal instrumentalization of human resources for the purpose of economic use becomes paramount. And you rightly mentioned a number of rules or a number of ideas pointing in that direction. So, for example, if one made parental care like mandatory, like maternal leave mandatory. Maternal leave is often mandatory. If you also made paternal leave mandatory, that is one way. By making it mandatory, you decommodify it, because all of a sudden the man has to take, the father has to take time off, and all of a sudden he has real time to take care of the son, and there's no temptation to both not to take anything, or to only the mother to take maternal care, maternal leave, and then for the father to continue working and service out the lost the care to someone else. So there are all kinds of ways in which parity, of course, is perfectly compatible with an adequate idea of community and citizenship. Nothing I say suggests that it can't be, but the concrete form that it takes, we have to take care that it doesn't take the form of reinforcing neoliberal trends of commodification and drawing people into the workforce for paid work, rather than doing something else with their time. So that's the critical caveat towards the end.
Thank you very much. Marta Cartabia.
Thank you very much. time is running very fast, so I have to drop almost all my comments. I will tell you in a separate venue. Anyway, I'm not sure here if I'm speaking, and I was invited to speak as a legal scholar or as a living quota, considering that I am the only woman at the Constitutional Court appointed by President Napolitano who simply considered unacceptable for a Constitutional Court not to have a woman sitting there. So very few consideration, although really the story and the presentation by Ruth was so fascinating and convincing to my point of view. What I liked most in this paper is that the paper shows that gender equality is a very important chapter of constitutional law. And it is a chapter that has the power to challenge some of the basic premises of classical constitutionalism. You said, give me a moment, constitutionalism was a reactionary force in implementing some measure for gender equality. At the very beginning, the idea you mentioned in your paper that the mythology of an independent individual was at the origin of the separate but equal tradition of the classical constitutionalists, since this independent individual has, in fact, to shift the burdens of his dependencies on the shoulders of women, you said. And at the very end of your paper, you also mention and question the idea of the neutrality of the state, advocating the idea that the piercing the veil of family privacy. I think that these statements are very important and cannot be underplayed, because they really question some basic axes of our constitutional mindset. Your journey through the different ages of constitutionalism moves back and forth on the two sides of the Atlantic. And there are two pivotal elements of this trajectory: family and work. And although the two approaches of American and European look very different, they are both a story of success. And in many Western countries, 100 years ago, we could even imagine to have women in the position of public authority, in corporate boarding, governance, and so on. They were only devoted to family care. However, I was wondering if this is a global picture or if it is a Western picture, because although you mention a number of South Latin American countries and improvements of some constitution, and also the image that you screened at the beginning was not concerning a Western country, nevertheless, the practice that you described are very Western, different Europe and American, but very Western. In other panels, Sheila Benhabib and others mentioned the struggle of women's rights in Asian, African countries. And I was wondering how's the report from the developments of constitutional law in those countries. Moreover, even in our Western country, there is another side of the moon to be highlighted. Let me simply mention the increasing number of brutal violence that women suffer in Western societies, where they have paid maternity leaves, maybe quotas in the ballots or in corporate governance. Enough here is to recall that the Council of Europe has approved the Convention of Istanbul in order to prevent some specific form of violence where women are victims. this is in a way marks a counter move from the story that you describe, because in a way this kind of situation calls for a gender-oriented legislation in order to take into account specific vulnerabilities of women. As to the description of the two different approaches of the United States and Europe during the 70s, I'm sorry, I'm going very quick, but for evident reasons, I cannot elaborate more on these statements. It was very interesting, this description. I think it was very convincing that on the one hand, you have this anti-stereotyping assimilationist model, and on the other hand, the accommodationist one. And I'm not sure if I properly understood, but to my view, that these two models promote two different types and ideal of women. The first one, the American one, is like an out woman, either mother or worker. And the second one is more an et woman, both mother and worker. And to this purpose, I would like to recall a famous expression by an Italian scholar, Laura Balbo, who spoke about the double presence of women that want to be both in private and public sphere at the same time. Well, these two different models can be explained with many very different reasons, different attitudes of Europe towards substantive equality, positive action, individual and groups, welfare measure. Here I would like to stress just one small thing, and it is that probably the European approach to non-discrimination and to equality is a little bit less court-centered than the American one. Because in the development, Bruno De Witte spoke about these developments in European law in a panel yesterday. Courts are not alone. There are a wide set of instruments and actors working for equality in Europe, legislature, administration, equality bodies, and the courts alone are not well equipped to set up an accommodationist model. They can boost, they can support what legislators and other administrative bodies do, but they are not able to take the lead in this move. Another set of remarks, I very much appreciated in your presentation that you put history and context in the analysis of gender equality. My intuition is that we can even move a step forward in this direction, more context, more history, more contextual analysis. Just two short suggestions. Why don't we think about modulating equality measures in different spheres of life? Some measures can be appropriated in education, some others in workplace, others in housing, politics, in some kind of professions. Like, borrowing the idea by Michael Walzer, spheres of injustice, why don't we think in terms of spheres of inequalities? Because sometimes my impression is that the idea of public presence of women is reduced to the idea of workplace or employment, where there are so many other differences. What about women in judging, for example, or healthcare, teaching at the academy, the military, the politics, diplomacy, business, and many other spheres? Maybe there are some measures that are appropriated in some fields and less appropriated in others, because I think that one of the major problems of our Western societies is that we have still a lot of sex typing jobs where women are present in great numbers and in other spheres where they are completely absent. I will skip the idea of time because we don't have time if you want still to finish at 1 o'clock. I don't know what are...
Plenary sessions are 1 hour and a half.
Okay, so just a final concluding remark and the rest will be for our conversation. What about the destiny of the Western model that you are describing in the new millennium that is overcoming neutrality and is trying to pierce in the veil of family privacy? You mentioned in your paper that maybe this strong and harsh economic and financial crisis is affecting the European development of gender legislation, slowing down a number of proposals for lack of money or for other reasons. I would like also to mention another hallmark change of European societies, which is the relentless waves of immigration. Different cultures cohabit now in Western countries, and one aspect, not a minor one, that marks the difference among cultures relates precisely to gender. In this context, piercing the veil can become a little bit problematic. We have to pay attention not to build up a model of gender equality that in fact address only a given kind of women, Western, white, middle, high class, learned, because women is a very diverse universe, and I think that one of the most daunting challenges of the new constitutionalism in our age, in our countries, is to tackle gender equality in a multicultural society. Thank you very much.
We have an announcement by Renzo Casini about publication of working papers. Why don't you? You can go there.
A quick announcement before giving back the floor to Sabino Cassese. Many people asked regarding the publication of the papers presented here. You may have received already an email saying that papers will be published somehow. The announcement is this. The idea is to publish the papers as ICON.S working papers, so there will be a series. This series will be launched on the website as a publication. There will not be a peer review process, so our request for people interested in publishing the papers in this new series is to send us the paper, hopefully polished, revised according to the comments in the panel's discussions, and panels will be numbered and published as ICON.S working papers. We also thought of publishing the papers in the International Journal of Constitutional Law and the European Journal of International Law. In this case, you are kindly requested to submit the papers because they will be review process. But please, in the footnote at the beginning of your article, make clear that the paper was presented at the first ICON.S conference. Thanks.
This conference comes to an end by number, gender, age, active participation has been a success. I have to thank 31 persons working for this conference. I will mention only two of them. One is Lorenzo and another one is Professor Simoncini, and many thanks to the organizers. We will return shortly to you. There is a lunch waiting for you. Have a safe journey home. Thank you very much.